While feats of engineering such as the Supermarine Spitfire might be traditionally thought of as the cornerstones of Britain's aerial defenses throughout World War II, one often overlooked piece of the puzzle doesn't get the attention it deserves. You see, having superior fighters is critically important to winning air superiority, but having superior muscle isn't the most important aspect of the war business. No, in fact, with the right advantages, even an inferior force might emerge victorious with the right information. That's why today we'll be looking at the most underrated piece of kit during World War II, the radio detecting and ranging equipment, or radar. But before we get started, let's take a minute to give a shout out to this channel's first official sponsor, World of Warships. Now, this channel typically focuses on aviation history, but due to my handy-dandy analytics, I know most of you have more varied interests. If you didn't know, World of Warships is a free-to-play game available for PC with next-level, top-notch graphics and more than 40 beautiful, unique battle maps. In my first few hours of gameplay, I felt like I was on some sort of tropical vacation, except there were large naval guns and explosions, so even better. If you're a fan of naval history, you'll be thrilled to know that the game features multiple ship classes such as battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and soon they'll have submarines, which is where you'll find me. Or won't, if you catch my drift. Now, if you're at all worried about becoming attached to a game and having it become stale, worry not, because World of Warships features new content releases every month. Whether that be new ships, in-game nations, cosmetics, or even ship classes, you can always count on enjoying fresh gameplay experiences in these massive 12v12 arenas. In terms of teams, it's pretty easy to go it alone or play with friends. So far, I've done really well alone, but I can only imagine how ridiculous things would get if you had an organized team that communicated well. Now, I wouldn't just take any sponsorship, and the reason I'm working with World of Warships is that this is more than just a simple game. The 3D modeling is incredible, and if you're interested in the finer points of naval history, you can think of World of Warships as essentially a unique digital floating museum, displaying breathtaking recreations of not just the most fearsome vessels of the First and Second World Wars, but also the many blueprints and designs that never saw light, but have been given life in the game's virtual dockyards. Also, if your PC isn't up to the task, the game is also on consoles. So to get an incredibly fun look at naval history, download the game below via the link in the description and use the promo code BRAVO during registration to get 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and 1 free choice ship after you complete 15 battles. And I know how you guys love to correct my pronunciation. I'm going to try to tell you which ships you have an option to choose. They are the USS Phoenix, Japanese cruiser Kuma, French battleship Courbet, I don't know, Italian battleship Dante Alighieri, or the HMS Wakeful. So once again, thank you World of Warships for sponsoring this video, and now back to radar. Now, it's a common misconception that radar was invented out of necessity during the Second World War. This is really only true to the extent that war forced the development of practical radar systems that were field deployable and could be mounted on ships. That being said, while these radar used during the war weren't the first of their kind, they marked the beginning of modern electronic warfare, as they were the first radars to be employed militarily. As airplanes increased in size, range, and speed in the 1920s, proponents of air power such as Billy Mitchell and Guillaume Duhet made it apparent to the world that aerial bombardment would be a major concern in any future conflicts. In fact, in 1932, Stanley Baldwin gave a speech entitled A Fear of the Future, in which he stated that contemporary bomber aircraft had the necessary performance to conduct a strategic bombing campaign that would destroy a country's cities, and there was little that could be done in response. This speech also coined the phrase, "the bomber always gets through." As you can imagine, the British were especially motivated to develop an early warning system in the face of Hitler's undefeated Luftwaffe, which was comprised of more than 2,400 fighters and bombers. As a result of this foresight, Sir Robert Watson Watt would develop for the British an entire network of long-range early warning radar stations whose reports were tightly integrated by fighter command. This was the Chain Home radar system, the first radar-based air defense system, which was ready just in time for the Battle of Britain. But before we cover that, let's take a step back and take a look at the state of things before radar came along. Realizing the ability to detect an incoming hostile aircraft would be of the utmost importance, the first technology employed for this task was that of the microphone. As such, the Brits developed an extensive network of sound mirrors that were used from World War I through World War II. Sound mirrors normally work by using movable microphones to find the angle that maximizes the amplitude of sound as received, which is also the bearing angle to the target. Two sound mirrors at different positions will generate two different bearings, which allows the use of triangulation to determine a sound source's position. As World War II neared, radar began to become a credible alternative to determining the location of aircraft. Britain never publicly admitted it was using radar until well into the war, and instead publicity was given to acoustic location, as in the US. It's been suggested that the Germans remained wary of the possibility of acoustic location, and this is why the engines of their heavy bombers were run unsynchronized instead of synchronized, in the hope that this would make detection more difficult. Whether or not this was successful, our sources didn't clarify. The physical principles that apply to all radars even today were first described by James Clerk Maxwell, formalized sometime between 1855 and 1861, and, perhaps ironically, experimentally observed by Heinrich Hertz in 1886. Famously, when asked about the potential applications of his discovery of propagating electromagnetic waves, Hertz replied, "Nothing, I guess." In a way, this sentiment would continue to haunt the German war effort through the end of the Second World War, but German radar technology, which did exist, is a topic for another video. In any case, in 1904, German physicist Christian Holzmeier recognized the usefulness of Hertz's measurements and patented the telemobiloscope, the first device using radio waves to detect distant objects, essentially a radar. During the First World War, the son of newspaper publisher August Schirl, Richard Schirl, also became interested in the idea of using radio echoes for detection, without knowledge of Holzmeier's previous work. He sent details of his apparatus to the Imperial German Navy in February 1916, but his suggestions were rejected as not being important to the war effort. While German radar development was very promising in its early stages, it was quickly overtaken by Allied technology. One major reason for this was that the German Navy, the most conservative of the three services, did not realize the full potential of active radar, leaving the Allies in a favorable position to force the pace of the microwave war. The German Navy had decided that radar transmissions would provide a source from which an enemy could obtain a fix on a ship's position, in the same way that direction finders could be used to obtain a fix on the source of a radio transmission. Extensive use of radar was discouraged, a decision reinforced by the German belief in the superiority of their optical equipment. Imagine being a young officer who was taught absolutely nothing about radar and had to learn from scratch about the complex microwave war while on active service, in conditions where any fault could be fatal. It wouldn't be until March 1945 that German Naval Command issued Tactical Order No. 10, entitled Instruction for Use of Radar Aboard Surface Units. World War II began in September 1939 when Germany invaded and quickly defeated Poland. By the summer of 1940, less than a year later, nearly all of Western Europe was under Nazi control. The British had been driven from the shores of Dunkirk and watched France crumble from across the English Channel. Now, Hitler turned his attention to Great Britain and began planning an invasion. To do so, Hitler needed to gain control of the English Channel. The German Navy couldn't do it, so Hitler hoped to destroy the British Navy and any coastal resistance with air superiority. Hitler had great faith in his undefeated Luftwaffe, and with good reason. Comprised of more than 2,400 fighters and bombers, it would face Britain's mere 900 standing fighters, although they were rapidly building more. With these dismal odds, the British needed an early warning system, one that would disclose the German air position and take away their element of surprise. This system would also allow British pilots to conserve precious time in flight and remove the necessity of mounting constant air patrols over the entire English East Coast. As we said, it was only through the extraordinary foresight of radio researcher Sir Robert Watson Watt that the British had in place in 1940 an entire network of long-range early warning radar stations. Now, to be fair, Chain Home wasn't necessarily the first working EW radar, but Chain Home is the first radar-based air defense system, essentially a government utility that just so happens to be exclusively for early warning bomber detection. Specifically, Chain Home was a pulsed Doppler radar. Pulsed radar sends a burst of radio energy at a target, then measures the time it takes for the energy to reflect back to its receiver. We can then easily calculate the range of the target by multiplying the time delta between sending and receiving the pulse by the speed of light. In the same way that we're all taught very early on that rate times time equals distance, the beauty of pulsed radar is that it works principally in exactly the same way. What made Chain Home unique was how it measured the bearing of the target. More conventional radars measure direction by sending and receiving the radio energy in narrow beams and scanning those beams around in space until a target is illuminated. The direction of the target is determined by the pointing angle of the antenna when the received target reflection is strongest. Now, there are a few drawbacks to this method. Narrow, laser-like beams require huge antenna arrays, and more importantly, to wholly eliminate ambiguity in the antenna's symmetrical radiation pattern, direction finding with a single narrow beam antenna array requires perfect characterization of an antenna's radiation pattern, which was a non-trivial exercise even today. Moreover, in the late 1930s, the technology to generate high-power pulsed radio energy at wavelengths short enough to make narrow beams did not exist. Instead, chain home relied on multiple low-gain broadside antennas that illuminated a larger area in comparison. These antennas did not move or scan at all, and the addition of multiple antennas eliminated directional ambiguity. To operate the radar, chain home operators chose a target on their screen and turned the knob of a special coil-like instrument to null out or minimize the blip. Then they could read the direction of this target from a scale around the knob. This device, called a radio goniometer, electronically steers the nulls instead of the peaks from a pair of simple fixed receiving antennas. This idea was invented during the first decade of radio technology development and was used by Watson Watt to track radio static generated by thunderstorms years before the war. The chain home radar system was designed to work at 25 MHz. Its antennas were hardly distinguishable from those of shortwave radio stations, and separate transmitting and receiving antennas were used as the duplexer had not yet been developed. Although it required intense human interaction, both to direction find each target and to filter the reports from many radar stations into a coherent air picture, the chain home system was highly effective, especially during those critical months in the summer and fall of 1940. Still, the Battle of Britain was a costly conflict. By the end of the battle, the Luftwaffe had lost some 1,700 aircraft and nearly all of their crew. Thanks to the early warning and raid locations provided to Fighter Command by chain home radar and the rapid production of replacement fighters, the British lost just over 900 aircraft and saved about half their pilots. And most importantly, they forced the Germans to abandon their plans to invade England. Meanwhile, the US, where time was not quite as pressing, used the extra time to develop VHF equipment. Using these very high frequencies, hence VHF, the size of the radar antennas could be reduced and bandwidth was increased. By the time the US entered the war, the 105 MHz SCR-270 and the 205 MHz SCR-268 were both operational. Infamously, the SCR-270 was successful in detecting the aircraft approaching Pearl Harbor, but the failure of the associated command and control systems are partially responsible for the ensuing tragedy. Also, the Australian RAAF deployed an SCR-270 at Dripstone Cliff in Darwin in 1942. Just a fun fact. Specifically, when compared to chain home, efficiency was enhanced by thinning the array, removing the top and bottom rows from the main azimuth antenna, while retaining the entire column of 6 elements in the elevation array. The array itself was highly redundant, so that damage to a single element would not disable the radar. Processing and tracking carried out by operators viewing cathode ray tubes and manually controlling the antenna pedestal were also redundant. What was lacking was the electronic beam steering used today for search and automatic tracking. Also lacking was the high resolution of modern arrays, which provide milliradian or better accuracy for fire control and missile guidance. The SCR-268 had to rely on accompanying optical trackers to refine its angle data for AA fire control, with the aid of searchlights slaved to the radar beam for night operations. Most of the air and naval actions in World War II fought with radar at ultra-high frequency and below. For example, early U.S. radar equipment operated at 200 MHz. The XAF and CXAM search radars were designed by the Naval Research Laboratory and were the first operational radars in the U.S. fleet produced by RCA. These were followed by large-scale production of other 200 MHz systems, the SA, the SK, and the SR. Other systems at 400, 600, and 1200 MHz became available by the end of the war. Microwave radar made its appearance in 1943 after the magnetron was developed into a high-power producible device. Low-power klystrons had long been used as local oscillators for superheterodyne receivers, as had parabolic reflector antennas. It required only a year to make the transition from the laboratory magnetron, which was like mid-1940 in England, to the first 10-centimeter experimental tracker at the MIT Radiation Laboratory. Another year brought the field test model of the XT-1, and by mid-1943, the SCR-584 was being delivered into production. This radar had a beam width of 4 degrees, which was 70 milliradians, which turned out to be adequate for direct input to anti-aircraft gun directors. Optical tracking continued to supplement the radar data, but the equality of automatic servo-controlled tracking was such that radar-controlled guns were highly lethal within their design range. With the deployment of shells containing radar proximity fuses, more on these in a minute, air defense reached a new high in effectiveness. By the end of the war, most U.S. search radar designs were using the doubly curved parabolic dish, in which shaped elevation coverage could be obtained either with an extended feed or with a single horn feed in a distorted parabolic shape to the reflector. In Europe, the microwave dish antenna was widely used, but it did not completely replace the parabolic cylinder for search radar use. One of the most advanced of today's radars seems to have been inspired by the AN/CPS-1, using back-to-back cylindrical reflectors with line feeds. A major innovation, however, is the use of broadband, equal line length Courbet feeds to achieve very low side lobes and beam positions which remain invariant with frequency over the entire operating band of the system. Now, before you argue other inventions were more groundbreaking than radar during the war, stop for a second and remember that the proximity fuse was also a form of radar equipment. In a proximity fuse, the idea was simple, but seemingly impossible. Let's put a tiny radar set on each artillery shell and have the radar set trigger the detonation of the shell when it was close to its target. Again, the big problem was finding suitably rigorous electronic equipment that could survive the immense G-forces that a shell is subjected to. Smaller and more rugged tubes and appropriate control systems were developed, and the proximity fuse moved rapidly from experimental device to use in practical weapons. By the end of the war, some 22 million such shells had been produced, and they became very important in artillery, particularly anti-aircraft artillery. To put this in perspective, while all the innovations and design efforts behind improving piston engine technology have been essentially abandoned by militaries in exchange for jet engine technology, proximity fuses that work in essentially the same way as these early types are still used today. So there you have it. In war, information is power. And what good is having the fastest aircraft or the biggest gun if you don't know where the enemy is going to be and when? By simply listening to their electromagnetic waves, the British were able to determine where the Luftwaffe would strike, and through their effective radar-directed defense efforts, they would stave off total annihilation, thereby bringing the rampaging Wehrmacht to a sudden stop.